Where seaweeds, on the other hand, it's really interesting how they grow them. They naturally grow in the ocean and just let it grow on its own. There's no, arable land that needs to be used. There's no need for fertilizers. There's no need for pesticides. They have this strain that we know will grow in this water. And there's actually been a lot of research, looking at like, okay, how does salinity, water temperature impact growth and all that kind of thing, so they can optimize the production of the seaweed itself. They grow it out on these lines. It also creates a natural refuge for, different marine life in the area.
Welcome to the Pet Food Science Podcast, where our goal is to share information to help fuel innovation in the pet food sector. I'm your host, Dr. Kate Shoveler, and I'm here today to discuss the benefits of dried seaweed in pet food with Dr. Ann Huss. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Dr. Ann Huss has received her Bachelor's of Science from South Dakota State University in Food Science and Microbiology, and then followed by a Master's from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in Food Science. She then completed her PhD and postdoctoral program in the Department of Grain Science at Kansas State University. Upon transitioning to industry, Ann focused on research and development of feed additives for pet food and livestock feeds, utilizing functional ingredients, including essential oils, probiotics, prebiotic fibers, immune stimulants like mannose oligosaccharides, among many others. She more recently worked for a pet food company focusing on many areas, including nutrition, formulation, and product development, prior to joining the Evolve team as a consultant. Well, Ann, let's get right into this. Let's just focus today on dry seaweed. I know that you and I have discussed some avenues outside of seaweed, but we will focus on dry seaweed today for our listeners. So maybe a brief introduction about what dry seaweed is, maybe a little bit where it comes from, and what is dried seaweed generally enriched in terms of its chemical composition.
All right, great. Sounds good. So seaweeds can be classified generally as brown, red, or green algae. And each group of those has a very diverse range of bioactive compounds. The majority of dried seaweeds that you're going to see out there in the food market or now coming into pet food are brown and red algae. And I kind of use seaweed and algae interchangeably. A lot of people think of algae as, the smaller in size sort of organism that usually is a lot higher in oil content, that you'll maybe get an extraction for DHA, enriched oil and things like that, where seaweeds are more of, thinking when you're in the ocean and that long stringy thing that maybe touches your foot and freaks you out kind of thing. So when I talk about seaweeds and algae, that's kind of what I'm referencing here. And actually, as I kind of dove into this topic of dried seaweeds, it's really interesting. Seaweeds have been used in human foods since like the 1970s. And one of the main structural components of seaweed is actually carrageenan, which is a sulfated polysaccharide. And it's used in a lot of different applications in different foods and pharmaceuticals, because it has this ability to bind ingredients together, holds water, and kind of like if you think of the texture and form of like a wet pet food, a lot of times those will have added carrageenan that kind of gives it that structure and that texture for it. And it's also used, pretty extensively in the dairy industry. You'll maybe see it in different like coffee creamers and ice creams or things like that to just kind of give everything a smooth texture and all of that. You could also see it in maybe some cosmetics and lotions, soaps, shampoos, and things like that. And actually even more interesting, I thought, is it's used quite extensively in pharmaceuticals. So for the use of maybe different dressings that have medications in them to help deliver them to like a surface wound or something like that. And then also you could think of brown algae are another really good source of alginates, and red algae also have agar, which, I'm a microbiology background, you use agar in everything when you're doing a lot of different experiments, growing different bacteria and things like that. So it's kind of interesting as I looked into this more of there's been a long history of cultivating seaweeds for multiple different purposes. And so it's interesting now that more and more research has been done to see, okay, carrageenan, for instance, we can use as a binder in different foods, but does it also have any health benefits? And so there has been a little bit of research looking more into carrageenan as a potential prebiotic. But not only do these seaweeds have, these fibers and things like that, they also carry along with them, lots of different vitamins, minerals, protein, some essential amino acids, and then some other really interesting bioactive compounds like polyphenols that would have, antioxidant or anti-inflammatory properties.
Interesting. Out of curiosity, other products, other ingredients that would be high in carrageenan would be?
That's a good question. I'm not sure as though carrageenan itself is found in other plant sources. It might be a little bit, but kind of one of the main structures in red seaweeds, for instance, is the carrageenan molecule itself, which is just a long chain of sulfonated galactans. And so other, ingredients you might have out there that would have a similar function would be something like guar gum, locust bean gum, xanthan gums, and things like that.
Okay, so all also soluble and probably range in fermentability as well, right?
Yeah, correct.
All the
Correct.
gums.
Benefits consumers want, partnerships you need. Schooler is your all-in-one partner for an innovative pet food supply. With an expansive portfolio and global access, we can source and deliver in-demand ingredients year-round. Schooler provides access to ingredients that are animal and marine ingredients, nutrient-rich, clean label, plant-based, freeze-dried, sustainable, MSC and Marin Trust certified, and more. That means you can offer on-trend products consumers want without disrupting production. Learn about the benefits of working with Schooler. Visit schooler.com/pet. That's SCOULAR.com/pet.
Okay, interesting. So that then really brings us to the fact that you're describing the nutrient delivery potential and specifically around some soluble fibers that have multiple benefits to the host, but can simultaneously have benefits for processing. So let's dive into that a little bit. Maybe talk a little bit about the health benefits associated with dried seaweed, specifically focused around the nutrients that seaweed tends to be enriched in. Let's start with the health benefits to the dog and the cat. And frankly, myself, I think I'm going to get some sushi on the way home, and I'm going to get the ones that have the excess amount of dried seaweed. It's the same, right?
A lot of different sushi. So, yep, exactly. So there's been a lot of really interesting studies done on dried seaweed and its prebiotic potential, I would say is one of its main health benefits. So there's been in vitro studies done in pigs and in poultry. And in fact, earlier this year, there was an article released on the inclusion of using dried seaweed, specifically 2 types of red seaweed supplemented into dog diets. And so in that study, they found, overall inclusion of these 2 different of either one red seaweed is Capophycus alvarez that was included, and against the control, it looked like it looks to have improved gut health, and improved antioxidant status, and improved overall immunity. And so this study was conducted in adult labs. And overall, they looked at a lot of different parameters in this study to kind of see what the supplementation was doing for the dogs. Overall, the food intake and palatability scores were not impacted by supplementation. So, that's a really good thing that you're going to add this ingredient and the dog still wants to eat it. They also looked at digestibility and didn't see any issues in that regard. And it's really interesting, when it comes to palatability for dogs specifically, that brown seaweeds have also been around for a while too. And a lot of times there'll be a limit on how much you can feed those because they do impact palatability because they can contain a lot of fluorotannins, which I believe are very bitter in tasting. And so the dogs don't like those. But luckily for red seaweeds, there's not a lot in there. So you don't have to worry about that palatability impact. So with those studies, they looked at gut microbiome changes, and they found that, with this inclusion at around 3%, bifidobacteria were higher and the Clostridia species were lower, which, as we know, bifido are very helpful bacteria to our gut and with our overall gut health. And they sort of validated all of that shift to bifidobacterial and lactobacillus strains in the gut with short chain fatty acid analysis. So they were seeing improved or higher levels of short chain fatty acids, especially acetate and lactate, that goes along with confirming that there's a shift in fermentation in the gut by bifido species. They also looked at reduced glutathione or GSH levels in the dogs, and they found there's a lot higher level of that in the animals, which leads to a greater ability to take on oxidative stress or any of those sorry, just went blank. A higher GSH level indicating the ability to take on more of those reactive oxygen species in the animal, which helps overall oxidative stress, which is, at the root of it, the cause of aging and disease like cancer. So this is really interesting, study I thought that just came out, and, all of that together just can help improve lifespan and, our dogs in general. Some other health benefits that have been identified are pretty interesting. A lot of times the inclusion of these seaweeds can help with just overall nutrient absorption. Because of the fiber content, kind of slows down things going through the GI tract. So then, the animal is better able to absorb those nutrients that are present in the diet from other ingredients that might be included. Seaweeds are also a great source of macrominerals, calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sodium, trace minerals. All of those are very important for skeletal structure, various enzyme systems within the body, regulating acid-base balance, osmotic pressure. There's so many things that we need these minerals for in our body that can come from the dried seaweed products. There's also been some research to show, those trace minerals like zinc are present, again, in that prebiotic activity, plus that antioxidant support, plus the added zinc can help just with gut health overall, and that can be seen then in skin and coat appearance. And then what's really interesting also about these dried seaweeds is historically brown seaweeds have been used, which do have some palatability concerns, but also have been found to be really high in iodine content, which can be detrimental. Like you have to limit inclusion then based on iodine. With red seaweeds, it's actually a lot lower in iodine content, so you don't have to have as many safety concerns with that. And so it doesn't always limit inclusion.
Okay, so it behooves the formulator that's considering algae to have a very clear macro and micro mineral content on the algae supply that they're getting, if they're even considering using it in a formula, because it's going to have a significant impact on the mineral balance. Is that?
Yeah, I would say, yep.
Fantastic. And then when you were, so all these benefits, when we're thinking about the addition of dried seaweed, and I'm pointing out in particular to the listeners here that we're talking about dried seaweed, which means that it's got less than 10% moisture in it. It's an important caveat because my next question is, where did the evidence suggest inclusion rate and a potential max? Because you've talked about the max a little bit where in terms of total percentage of the formula are they kind of seeing that line? With the caveat that doesn't mean all seaweeds, you still have to have a nutrient analysis of your seaweed to formulate it with. But what is generally the inclusion that's being targeted?
So for a lot of these studies, specifically this dog study that came out earlier in the year, they used inclusion levels at 1.5% and 3%. And so somewhere in between there would be good. And these were in dry kibble diets that it was included at. With research that Evolve has done, they've looked at using this dried seaweed material at about 1% to really get the functional processing benefits along with those added health benefits. It's not quite as high as what we've seen in the dried kibble formulations, but with that inclusion level, they were able to get the form and the texture of the product they were targeting because it was a wet application.
Okay, so just for mainly my clarity as well here, we're looking at about a 3% inclusion when we're talking about a dry diet. And that's to drive in most of these potential health benefits to the animal. But then when we're thinking about wet diets, where dried seaweed brings in this viscosity attribute as well. Sorry, what was the inclusion that would obtain that level of viscosity if you're using dry seaweed?
Ideally, about 1% seems to be a good starting point. You're going to have that vary a little bit depending on what other ingredients are in that diet. With research we've done, it looked like we could replace all other sources of binders. So no guar gum or xanthan gum or anything else like that included in the diet. We were able to completely replace that with the dried seaweed.
Okay,
And
so
so it does give a really nice label read if we can take off some of those ingredients that consumers may perceive as not ideal.
absolutely. And so just again for everyone, that was 1% in a wet formula, in a canned formula for its physicochemical properties, not just its physiological benefits to the animal. So that's a really important aspect too. I completely agree with the labeling. I guess my next question too is, and I would think that these more refined sources of thickeners and gelling agents and binders and everything that we use kind of have more process put into them. Is there a sustainability, environmental boost to considering dried seaweed instead of some of these other binders as well that pet food companies and should be interested in, and mainly because the consumer is extremely interested in this, especially Gen Z, quite interested in the environmental impact?
Yes, definitely. Sustainability is actually really interesting with these dried seaweeds because if you think about, say, just another functional ingredient like inulin from dried chicory root. If you know anything about dried chicory root or chicory root production, it's a lot like sugar beet production, where in March you start planting all the seedlings. They grow throughout the summer, and you start to harvest chicory in the fall, September, October, November. And then it produces these roots that are essentially ground up. A hot water extraction is used to release all of the inulin because a chicory root typically only has about 16% inulin, I believe. And I reference inulin because I kind of think of it as like maybe the gold standard for prebiotics, as a functional ingredient. And so with all of that, if you just think about that's a traditional agriculture practice of planting a crop, letting it grow, maybe applying fertilizer a few times a year or throughout the growing season or pesticides, then going on to harvesting and then, taking this ingredient, putting it through a huge process of extraction and then drying it. It's very intensive if you think about the footprint, the environmental footprint it's going to take to process all of that. Whereas seaweeds, on the other hand, it's really interesting how they grow them. They naturally grow in the ocean. So down in Malaysia or on the Indian coast or something like that, they'll actually grow the seaweed. They'll start it on these lines in the ocean and just let it grow on its own. There's no, arable land that needs to be used. There's no need for fertilizers. There's no need for pesticides. They have this strain that we know will grow in this water. And there's actually been a lot of research, looking at like, okay, how does salinity, water temperature impact growth and all that kind of thing, so they can optimize the production of the seaweed itself. They grow it out on these lines. It also creates a natural refuge for, different marine life in the area. Fish may be around. It can help improve water quality with the absorption of excess nutrients that would maybe go to algal blooms in the area instead. And so then, once the seaweed gets to maturity or where they want to harvest it, they'll go ahead and pull those lines in and then, start the process of, drying it down and turning it into a powder. So it's a highly sustainable industry that's been around for a while. And it, along with the sustainability, it also has a positive economic impact to the local area. It really, allows for job creation. It diversifies the local economies. So, maybe during the fishing season, off season, this fishermen will go into seaweed growing and things like that, or do them both. And then it also just meets this growing demand for the use of dried seaweed just because of its overall health benefits for, humans and animals.
Yeah, it sounds like a really great alternative ingredient, and we're really piling up on the alternative ingredients in the pet food industry. I'm really happy to see these plant-based alternatives as an example. But I'm all for the inclusion of animal-based products as well. But we need a much wider variety, and it sounds like dried seaweed might be a really great consideration for pet food companies, whether they are looking at either a dry application or a wet application. So thank you for going over that.
84 million times a day, pets eat meals with ingredients from Trow Nutrition. We bring together the science of ingredients, nutrition, and blending to unleash possibilities for pet food brands. Premixes are just the start. Turn to Trow for higher inclusion ingredients too, like proteins and carbohydrates, and highly sensitive ingredients like probiotics. With our palatants and base blends, you can feel confident about what comes in our bags and goes in yours. Learn more at TrowNutritionPets.com.
Now the really hard part, which is first of all, you are a consultant for the pet food industry. If people would like to reach out to you in terms of consultation, they can do so on LinkedIn. That's where I found you.
Yep, they for sure can through LinkedIn or through our website, evolveconsultgroup.com. And we'd love to help with any formulations, starting to end, helping with ingredient procurement, finding out where to manufacture, formulation, quality testing, palatability trials, anything like that.
Fantastic. It's a great resource. And I know one of your colleagues well, and so really great resource for the pet food industry. So everyone reach out to Evolve Consulting or Ann Huss herself, and she will talk you through these options that you might have. Next, though, who is marketing dried seaweed? Which companies are these coming from? Are they also reaching out to the pet food industry themselves to consider entering it in a bit of a broader scope as a ingredient alternative?
Yeah, I think so. So the main company that I know that's really bringing dried seaweed to the market is the Schooler company. So they are offering a dried seaweed product that Evolve has used in some wet pet food formulations. And then the group that is making the product down in Borneo is actually conducting their own animal research trials to really show the health benefits of this ingredient and how it could, kind of serve two purposes. Has a functional processing effect, getting you a clean label, but still be allowing you to keep, the form you want or texture in wet foods or semi-moist or things like that. Plus has these added health benefits for the animal that is a sustainable resource also, a sustainable product that, the pet food industry is really looking for.
Fantastic. Yes. And then personally for yourself, if we look at the cross application and really the amount of literature and data that's been generated on seaweed and algae in humans and agricultural animals, I really push people. I call myself a comparative nutritionist. We always have to end up doing work in dogs and cats when it comes to ingredients that are maybe new. But the basis across all mammalian species and terrestrial species is generally conserved. So you can always start your research in other animals and in humans. And this really also, we definitely follow human trends. So people keeping their eye on what's happening in the human food industry gives us a little bit of a glimpse. And indeed, you see all kinds of seaweed snacks out there as an example. The same push behind the human seaweed then.
Yep, that's correct. And yeah, it's nice that there's actually been, a few studies done directly in dogs and in cats on feeding this ingredient to, kind of give you that reassurance that yes, it's safe, but obviously you always need to follow inclusion guidelines. A little bit goes a long way sometimes.
Absolutely. And I think maybe just a really big reminder for the listeners as well is that absolutely, and it doesn't just mean seaweed. You need a really good nutrient analysis of your ingredient and need to understand what the variability in that nutrient delivery is to really understand how it's going to impact the different diets that you're adding it to.
Correct.
ICC Animal Nutrition, a Brazilian company with 30 years of history and present in more than 70 different countries, providing natural, sustainable, and technological solutions for animal nutrition, health, and well-being in a safe and scientific way, adding value in food production and helping to feed the world.
So with that, do you have any final comments about seaweed that we might not have touched upon today?
I don't think so. I think it's a really interesting ingredient, and I think it's just another tool in the toolbox to really help our dogs and cats live an optimal, healthy life.
Excellent. Well, with that, thank you so much for your time today. And I hope you come back. We talked about some other potential things that you could definitely come back and talk about, such as different applications of different processes to seaweed and how that might affect their nutrient density. So I look forward to that request in the future, Anne. And with that, thank you for being here. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you.